DOJ and all of the agencies involved will continue to dismantle this transnational criminal organization.
Imagine waking up at 4 in the morning to find 3 entire states shaking at once. Black helicopters filling the sky, armored vehicles sealing every intersection. 3.8 tons of narcotics dragged out of hidden warehouses, 120,000 synthetic pain pills sealed, and more than 2,000 families finally getting answers about loved ones who vanished. But what left millions of Americans frozen wasn't the sheer volume seized. It was the name behind it all, a sitting state governor, dozens of sheriffs, and a pipeline called Crimson Raven. This is 100% real, happening right now on American soil, and the most terrifying part hasn't even been told yet. Are you ready? At 4:12 in the morning in southern Ohio, the largest operation in U.S. history unfolded with 3.8 tons of narcotics, 120,000 synthetic pain pills, and more than 2,000 missing persons cases brought into the light. This was an unprecedented multi-state federal sweep. We need to clarify everything tied to this pipeline. It all started deep inside America in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, where a string of residents vanished without a trace. Over the past 14 months, more than 2,000 men, women, and teenagers have gone missing across these 3 states. At the same time, law enforcement logged 6,300 drug-related arrests, all tracing back to one name whispered in dread: the Crimson Raven Network. This is no ordinary retail group. This is a massive underground organization built on the distribution of narcotics, illegal, human trafficking, extortion, and money laundering. Their network stretches from the Mexico border all the way to the Great Lakes region, running through farms, trucking companies, abandoned mines, and charity centers that are nothing more than fronts. Federal investigators have been tracking their ever-expanding pattern of operations. Shipments arrive on the same night, the same trucks leave the same warehouse, and at the exact same time, local people vanish whenever the ring needs fresh victims. Behind it all, one alarming truth has gradually come to light every time law enforcement gets ready to take down a route the targets already know in advance. Every time a suspected location is pinpointed, the place has already been cleared out just minutes before the raid teams arrive. Someone with real power is shielding them. That someone has access to intelligence reports, police databases, and sealed investigations. When the agents spread the map across the table, one chilling truth stares back at them. This is not just a criminal network infiltrating America. This is America being sold from the inside. If you've ever noticed similar signs in your own area, share them in the comments. Silence only lets the threat spread. The deeper the investigators dig, the same pattern keeps repeating itself. Raids fail too early, targets vanish too fast, and the transport routes keep running as if someone with real authority is clearing the way. That person finally has a name. Gregory Holston, 52 years old, governor of Ohio, the man elected to protect the people now exposed as the political shield for the Crimson Raven Syndicate. The evidence is undeniable. 17 wire transfers routed through shell companies in Mexico. 4 properties purchased under relatives' names, every single one sitting directly on the main smuggling corridors. Encrypted messages pulled from a seized burner phone reveal something far worse than bribery. Holston was personally coordinating the syndicate's operations inside the United States. He fed them federal task force movements. He redirected state patrol units away from the syndicate's warehouses and helped bury the investigation into the attack 2 weeks ago that left 2 officers and 1 civilian wounded. For the federal agents, the realization cuts deep. This isn't one rogue cop on the take. This is the sitting governor of Ohio turning his office into the command center for a criminal empire. 12 police chiefs, 4 deputy directors, and 39 officers tied to Holston have been exposed as drawing paychecks from both the state and the syndicate. In a closed-door briefing, one agent finally said the words nobody wanted to hear: "If a governor can be bought, no state is safe." This betrayal is no longer political. It's personal. A knife in the back of the very communities Holston once swore to protect. If this shocks you, hit that like button, because the next part is when the federal government finally hits back, and hits back hard. Once the governor's betrayal was laid bare, the task force commanders knew one thing for certain: hesitation would let Crimson Raven vanish again. So they chose speed shock and overwhelming force. At 4:30 in the morning, 3 states moved at once as federal helicopters sliced through the night sky and armored convoys rolled like black waves. Operation Red Harvest had begun, and the entire syndicate was now the target. In the first 6 minutes alone, thermal drones swept across fields, rooftops, and highway truck stops, lighting up the screens with blazing signatures. The syndicate's lookouts panicked, half-dressed, their radios exploding with screams. But it was already too late. The federal teams were in position. The first breach hit a warehouse on the outskirts of Columbus. The steel doors blew inward. Flashbangs detonated the concussion, slamming off concrete walls like thunder. In seconds, agents poured through the smoke rifles up commands, ripping through the air suspects face down and cuffed before a single shot could be fired. 27 arrests, 0 rounds expended. Farther east in West Virginia, teams pushed into the abandoned coal mine tunnels the syndicate had retrofitted. The air inside was thick with rust and cold metal, every footstep and muffled breech charge echoing for miles. Agents moved with infrared sights, peeling back false walls to expose hidden chambers stacked with tons of narcotics and the personal belongings of victims trafficked against their will. The silent evidence of unimaginable crimes. At the same instant, Pennsylvania erupted. A syndicate convoy tried to bolt from a rural depot, engines roaring as they punched through the perimeter, but federal forces were already waiting. Spike strips shredded tires in seconds. Armored vehicles slammed the jaws shut front and rear. In moments, the entire column was dead on the road. Drivers dragged out radios, seized weapons, kicked aside. By 4:51 a.m., the first wave was over and the numbers were staggering. 34 locations hit 72 suspects in cuffs. 3.8 tons of narcotics, seized 120,000 synthetic pain pills, recovered 187 firearms taken off the street, and $4.1 million in vacuum-sealed cash. But the most chilling discovery came out of Ohio. Inside a heavily guarded storage facility tied directly to one of Governor Holston's secret properties, agents uncovered documents laying out plans to expand the trafficking corridors into 6 additional states. The message was unmistakable. This was never just local. This was systematic infiltration. And for the first time, Crimson Raven felt what they had inflicted on thousands of American families: fear. Like and share if you believe the American people need to know what happens after the gunfire stops, because the real fallout is only just beginning. As the sun came up, the shooting was over, but the shock was only getting started. From the small farming towns of Ohio to the quiet mountain roads of West Virginia and the gray suburbs of Pennsylvania, one truth settled like dust after the blast. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. He had been inside the house the whole time. News of Governor Holston's betrayal spread faster than the federal convoys that tore through the night before. By 7:15 in the morning, every radio station, diner, and church parking lot was buzzing with the same stunned question: how long had he been helping them? For too many families, the answer landed like a punch in the gut. The very 12 months that saw more than 2,000 people vanish and 6,300 arrests were the same months Holston's office quietly redirected state resources, stalled investigations, and buried complaints from desperate parents searching for their kids. In Wheeling, West Virginia, volunteers who had spent months organizing search parties sat in silence as the news broke. Some wept openly, others just stared. For the first time, their grief had a face, and it was wearing a suit. Up in northern Pennsylvania, people lined up outside a youth outreach center that had just been sealed off. Inside, investigators were pulling out clothes, IDs, and traces of narcotics, proof the place had been a trafficking way station hiding behind a charity's name. Parents stood with hands over their mouths, speechless. Betrayal was no longer abstract, it was tangible, and it hurt like hell. By mid-morning, protests were erupting across all 3 states. They weren't riots, they were calm, furious, and growing. If you found out your own governor had been running cover for a human and drug trafficking ring, what would you do first? They knew exactly why they were there. Seniors held signs that read, "Protect our children and stop selling out our communities." Veterans raised American flags with black mourning bands stitched beneath the stars, grieving badges that had been bought and sold. By noon in Columbus, a massive banner hung across the State House steps, "Honor the badge. Remove the traitor." Even veteran officers felt the weight. At one police station, 2 retired chiefs sat shoulder to shoulder watching the news crawl, naming the dozen police chiefs and 4 deputy directors on the take. Their hands shook. We trained them to serve the people, and they turned their backs on the very people they swore to protect. Meanwhile, federal analysts kept digging through the seized documents. What they uncovered confirmed the worst fear the syndicate's tentacles had reached into state contract offices, local courts, and even emergency response teams. Entire neighborhoods had been deliberately left unprotected. For many Americans over 60 who had lived through earlier crime waves, the feeling was both familiar and heavier than ever. This time, the threat wasn't just from criminals, it was the shattering of trust itself. And when trust breaks, the road back is long, brutal, and uncertain. As morning sunlight stretched across the Ohio River Valley, federal officials already knew the raids were only the beginning. Crimson Raven had survived not because it was strong. It survived because someone stronger was shielding it, and that meant the next phase would be the hardest cleaning out America's own house. In a secure conference room in Washington, the Attorney General signed the new emergency directive Operation Black Lantern. The target was no longer drugs, guns, or cash. The mission was to identify every single traitor still wearing a badge holding elected office or controlling compromised state systems. For the men and women leading the operation, the reality was brutal. They now had to hunt the very people they once stood shoulder to shoulder with. Before dawn the next day, unmarked federal vehicles began rolling up to police stations across Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. No sirens, no lights, just dim headlights and the low, steady growl of engines pulling up to buildings where corruption had taken root like black mold behind the walls. At 5:04 in the morning, the first wave began. Federal agents walked into the Ohio State Police headquarters with emergency arrest warrants. Inside, 3 commanders and 2 deputy directors were taken into custody without a fight. Offices were sealed, computers seized, financial servers imaged. Minutes later, another team hit a suburban Pennsylvania precinct. 4 officers who once led the narcotics unit were walked out in cuffs, not for incompetence, but for feeding early intel straight to the syndicate's scouts. A drone captured the moment from above, officers walking past their own patrol cars, heads down, badges already stripped. The footage swept the country in hours. By noon, the number of cops arrested for corruption across the 3 states had climbed to 56. But Operation Black Lantern was far from over. In the Financial Crime Lab, analysts worked through the night tracing more than 900 suspicious accounts. What emerged was a money laundering web so intricate it left even veteran investigators stunned. Payments labeled as training stipends, emergency overtime equipment, reimbursements all funneled back to shell companies in Texas, Arizona, and Mexico. Some officers had been pulling double salaries for more than 3 years, one from the state, one from the syndicate. Even more alarming, federal auditors discovered Governor Holston's office had quietly approved state contracts to non-existent companies, diverting more than $28 million through fake infrastructure projects that ultimately landed in accounts controlled by Crimson Raven. This was no longer corruption. This was co-governance between elected officials and a criminal cartel. 2 judges in Ohio and 1 in West Virginia were served federal arrest warrants after rulings were uncovered that dismissed trafficking charges in exchange for syndicate payoffs. One of those decisions had freed a high-ranking Crimson Raven lieutenant only 6 months earlier. One agent staring at the case files said it plain that wasn't justice that was a marketplace. When word of the purge reached the public, the reaction was equal parts relief and rage relief that arrests were finally happening, rage at how deep the betrayal ran. In Wheeling, Charleston, and Pittsburgh, citizens gathered outside federal buildings with American flags and signs that read, "Clean the badge. Finish the job." For many older Americans who lived through the drug wars of the 80s and the scandals of the 90s, the moment felt eerily familiar, yet carried a flicker of hope. This time, the government wasn't hiding the rot. They were ripping it out by the roots. What started as a narcotics investigation had become something far bigger. The war for the integrity of American law enforcement. And Operation Black Lantern had only reached its halfway mark. By the dawn of the 4th day after the raids, the chaos had subsided into a cold, uneasy silence. The evidence vaults were full. Corrupt officers had been dealt with. The network of Governor Gregory Holston had collapsed like rotten timber under a sledgehammer. But inside the Louisville Command Center, no one felt victory. Not yet. Because one line on the operations board remained painfully blank. Leadership status of Crimson Raven unknown. The very top tier, the financial masterminds, the transport coordinators, and the domestic command structure had all vanished in the night, slipping through the cracks like smoke from a burning building. Then at 6:41 a.m., the silence shattered. A DHS imagery analyst monitoring Great Lakes satellite feeds spotted 3 vessels moving in an abnormal formation across Lake Erie. They carried no commercial registry numbers broadcast. No transponder signals showed no running lights, violating every maritime regulation on the books. At first, the analyst assumed smugglers. Then the imagery sharpened. What they saw froze the entire room. These were no fishing boats or pleasure craft. These were retrofitted cargo ships, lightened for speed, reinforced for heavy loads, purpose-built to move people and product across state lines without ever being seen. The hulls had been repainted, the engines supercharged. Someone had poured serious money, syndicate money, into preparing for something far bigger than drugs. Minutes later, encrypted radio chatter was intercepted. 2 words repeated over and over: Phoenix Rising. The pipeline wasn't broken, it was reorganizing, and whoever had stepped in to replace Holston's network was already moving. On the federal map, new lights began to flare. Unusual cargo movement near the Canadian border. Encrypted bursts bouncing off cell towers outside Toledo. Missing trucks resurfacing in eastern Michigan. Uniformed guards posted at abandoned factories. The pattern was unmistakable. Crimson Raven was shifting operations north along a new corridor, one far harder to police than the old Appalachia network ever was. A senior DHS commander asserted they were not retreating but migrating. At 7:12 a.m., Washington issued a secret directive to redeploy forces in silence with absolutely no leaks. The Coast Guard was shifted to the Great Lakes. The FBI Hostage Rescue Unit quietly moved into Michigan under civilian cover, and the Northern Border Response Group was activated. By evening, winds over Lake Erie carried a tense anticipation as Crimson Raven surviving the purge returned sharper and more dangerous. Exposing high-level corruption, though painful, was essential to restore trust. And although 3 states were nearly turned into hunting grounds, it was ordinary people who stayed vigilant and spoke out that ultimately forced the system to act. The greatest lesson Operation Crimson Raven leaves every one of us is this: the silence of ordinary people is what feeds corruption and crime the most. For 14 months, more than 2,000 people vanished. Tons of narcotics flooded communities. Yet it was only when mothers, fathers, neighbors, and gray-haired elders started asking questions, filing complaints, organizing searches, and refusing to shut up that the system was finally forced to act. Not politicians, not big agencies, but regular citizens became the spark that brought the whole empire crashing down. Remember, when you see something wrong, never assume someone else will speak up. You are the someone else who can change everything. The Crimson Raven story hasn't ended. It has simply turned to a colder, more dangerous chapter on the frozen waters up north. Thousands of families are still waiting for final answers. Hundreds of traitors are still hiding inside the system, and a syndicate that nearly turned 3 states into its private fiefdom is quietly rising again. So tell me, in your opinion, what is the single biggest lesson from this whole operation? How do we make damn sure that never again can a governor, a sheriff, or anyone else sell out their own community? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Like the video, share it so more people wake up, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because this fight is far from over. See you in the next one.